Hi there. This is Dr. J. Kent Gregory again, and welcome to part two of the discussion of Chapter 3, External Analysis. And during this chapter, or this discussion, we'll talk about Porter's five forces. So, what is the five forces model? Well, it's a method to do a couple things. One, to evaluate the profit potential of an industry, and then two, to evaluate the company's strategic position within the industry. So, an industry, just to clarify, is a group of companies or organizations that face the same set of suppliers and customers. So, the stronger the five forces, the lower the industry's profit potential. So the weaker the five forces, conversely, the greater the industry's profit potential. But let's look at what those five forces are. They're the threat of entry, the bargaining power of suppliers, the threat of substitutes, the bargaining power of, I'm sorry, suppliers here, buyers over here, and then the rivalry amongst existing competitors. So threat of new entrants. So this is what we'll talk about here. So there are two effects. Lowering prices by incumbents, and they spend more to defend their position. Meaning, if there's a threat of an entrant into the industry, what the incumbent companies within the industry will do is they'll lower their prices. And that makes it much more difficult for a potential entrant into the industry to make money. And then also those companies, they're charging lower prices, so they're not making as much as they would have in the past. But then they also have to spend more to defend their position. So some things to note here are economies of scale. Uh, so those companies that are incumbent, they have cost advantages resulting from their size. And we can kind of think of some economies of scale that have been achieved by Tesla and then, of course, Walmart, right? Um, and then also in there are customer switching costs. So these are costs incurred when changing vendors or when changing, who you're going to buy your product from. So meaning if you're used to buying all your stuff from Walmart, going to a new company in that area or that industry may be harder. Uh, Capital requirements, this is the price of entry. So, meaning how much capital do you have to devote to your company or your product to get into the industry? In the examples of where high price of entrants are starting an automobile company or pharmaceutical company, and then network effects, which are all covered in the book. So the threat of new entrants. Uh, uh, their advantages independent of size, government policy. So these are government policies that prevent or restrict entrance. Some of the things we can think of as China and the restrictions that they have on companies who try to enter there. And then there's the credible threat of retaliation. Well, this is where you risk existing firms or the risk of existing firms uh, aggressively defending their market space. And this is, you can see it in craft beer, where the big boys in the industry are buying up all the hops, or buying up a lot of the hops, making it harder for the smaller companies. Bargaining power of uh, buyers or customers. Uh, the greater their power, the less attractive the industry. Powerful buyers can also demand lower prices. Uh, if a buyer purchases a significant percent of a seller's output or product, examples are things like Walmart. Uh, if industry has a standard or commodity products, gasoline, or if the customer has no or low switching costs. All right, and readily available substitutes. So the threat of substitutes. The more the larger number of viable substitutes in an industry makes it less attractive. Substitutes can capture market share from the industry and drive down prices. And that, again, they capture then part of the industry's profit potential. So think of things where the substitute is pretty easily, where you can move between Sling or Hulu and Netflix or Amazon Prime. Um, but then notice how some of those companies try to defend their position by having specialized or, uh, exclusive releases. Bargaining power suppliers. This is where the greater the supplier power, the less attractive the industry. Powerful suppliers can raise the cost of production, meaning they can demand higher prices. Uh, for example, suppliers industry more concentrated than the industry it sells to. That means there's less suppliers than there are buyers. The suppliers don't rely on industry for a large portion of revenue. A great example, some automakers, uh, for example, Ford sells only to law or sells a large portion of their cars to law enforcement. Um, and there are some other examples, all of which are discussed. And then rivalry among existing competitors. Uh, the greater the rivalry, the less attractive the industry. Intense rivalries can result in price discounting and thus industry profit erosion. And then the other four forces put pressure on this force, right? Okay, and the intensity is determined by four components: in the industry competitive structure, the industry growth, strategic commitments, and then exit barriers, all of which we'll be talking about next in part 2. Thank you much.